Fabian Society. Welcome to this special joint meeting looking at progressive left responses to the economic crisis created by coronavirus. It's a joint meeting today between the Fabian Society, the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung's London office, and the Aston Centre for Europe at Aston University in Birmingham. We're delighted today to have some incredible expertise from both the UK and Germany. We're going to be hearing presentations and then questions afterwards, presentations from two key responders to the crisis. First of all, our UK speaker is going to be Annalisa Dodds, the Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer, leading on finance and the economy for the Labour Party in the UK. And then we'll be hearing from Jakob von Weizsäcker, who is the chief economist in the German Finance Ministry and has been at the heart of Germany's response to the crisis, which is, from the UK perspective, seemed to be a great deal more assured than the UK's response, not just to public health, but today our focus on economic measures. Really looking forward to hearing Jakob, and he comes from the Social Democrat family as well as a former MEP representing the SPD. After we've heard from both Annalisa and Jakob, we will be having a question and answer session, and that's going to be facilitated by Carolyn from the Aston Centre for Europe. Just to finish off my opening welcome, I just want to say a tiny bit about the technology. I'm sure an awful lot of you are now very familiar with Zoom. We've spent the last 3 months getting used to it. But the way we'll do this webinar is if you'd like to ask a question, we'd like you to type it in. So you'll see there's a question and answer function in the at the bottom of the screen. So what we'd like you to do is to type in a question there, and then Carolyn will be able to pick out the key questions from there. And to help her do that, you can also vote on other people's questions and rank them. So that will mean that we'll see which are the most popular questions that have been asked, and that will hopefully mean that you're more likely to pick out if the other participants on the call want to hear that question answered as well. Welcome from me, really looking forward to the discussion. I'd now like to hand over to Christos from the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung.
Thank you very much, Andy. And let me just say a few words of why we're doing this. The Friedrich Ebert Stiftung is a big socialist or social democratic think tank in Germany, and we're trying to think of ourselves as the think tank of social democracy. And faced with this economic crisis, our progressives reaction is, first of all, an internationalist one. We want to learn from each other. We want to inspire each other on how to build back better. And that was the idea of bringing Annelies and Jakob together today. And as far as I know, you both came together into the European Parliament in 2014 and joined the Committee on Economic and Monetary Affairs. So I presume it's the continuity of a debate you already had. And from my point of view, there are three very big challenges right now. It's a short-term challenge of how to limit the damage on our economies, and it would be interesting to hear how we're doing this in both countries. It's a midterm challenge, how to avoid job losses and losses of businesses all over the place. But there's a long-term challenge as well, and I think Annelies mentioned that last week in the House of Commons, how to build a bridge towards a more sustainable and fairer economy of the future. And I'm looking forward to this debate, and thank you all for joining us. Annelies, you go first.
Well, thank you very much indeed for the invitation to be with everyone today. It's really such a privilege. It's absolutely lovely. And obviously I'm a proud Fabian, but also, really appreciate all the work that Fez has been doing as well. And it's fantastic to have the connection between the Fabians and Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. And of course, it's really wonderful to be on this panel with Jakob. I don't want to, I suppose, make him feel uncomfortable, but I have to say, when he was a parliamentarian with me in the European Parliament, he was one of the most principled advocates for social democracy that I ever met. He really was. He was someone who really very much had the interests of people at heart all the time, including on quite very technically challenging areas like banking regulation. So it really is wonderful to have him on this call with us now. And I'm really delighted that he's playing such a critical role in the German response and doing an excellent job with that. I suppose just to kind of kick off this discussion quite briefly, I wanted to focus a little bit on some of the particularly strong challenges facing the UK and some of the ways in which the response so far hasn't, I think, worked to or hasn't worked as well as it could have done, and what we need to do into the future. I think, first of all, we cannot separate, I mean, it's an obvious point, but we can't separate how we deal with the public health crisis and how we then deal with the resultant economic crisis. And it won't be news to many people on this call that, of course, the UK has been particularly hard hit by coronavirus. We know that very, very sadly from the excess death statistics that make that very clear. But we've particularly been very slow at getting some of the mechanisms put into place that would enable us to have a resumption of economic activity that is widely supported by the entire population. The kinds of testing, track and tracing regime that is already in operation in Germany and has been for some time is really not fully rolled out across the UK, unfortunately. We've just had an additional spike of coronavirus cases we're still having it in the city of Leicester. And it took, in that case, many, many days for information to be passed on to local public health officials. It took a very long time for an additional lockdown to be put into place. Overall, the UK system has been very, very slow. And I think that's a major issue for our economic response, because our Chancellor has been announcing some stimulus measures, particularly focused on hospitality and tourism last week. But actually, if people don't have confidence to be going into different business premises, then incentives like that will only have a limited impact. I know that this has been an issue generally across all nations. Of course, many people are naturally and understandably worried about going into any situations where other consumers are there. But it seems to be a particular problem with the UK situation, where there's really quite a small number of people, I believe it's in the 20 or 30% number of people who will actually be taking up, for example, the so-called meal deal voucher, Eat Out to Help Out, because it appears many of them are concerned about whether the right measures are in place health-wise. In terms of the UK's response to the immediate economic damage, I mean, a number of elements of the response, of course, UK Labour called for, particularly the so-called job retention scheme, so-called furlough scheme. It wasn't initially a short hours scheme because it didn't initially facilitate part-time working. That's now come on stream from the beginning of this month, which we called for a long time. We want to make sure that people can be getting back to work when it's possible for them to do so. We also, of course, had the self-employed support scheme put into place in the UK, but quite major issues with both of those because of the extent of, I suppose, what you could call non-standard working patterns in comparison with lots of other countries in the UK. So about 3 million people in the UK who haven't been able to come under either the furlough scheme or the self-employed support scheme because they might, for example, use a variety of different employment types. They might sometimes be paid directly by an employer, other times be self-employed and so forth. So they haven't benefited from that support. There's been some uprating of social security, but we would argue most definitely not enough. A loan scheme that's quite sluggish to get going initially still hasn't provided a lot of support for our manufacturers, something I'll come back to later, but which has provided at least some initial support after it was altered to get the funding from banks to small businesses in particular more quickly, and also deferred taxation being put into place as well. And of course, that's particularly significant in the UK when we have a system of business rates levied on business premises, quite different to the tax situation in many other countries. So overall, you know, the quantum of all of that package together from the UK does look quite substantial, but then I think there are really significant issues when we look into, well, is it really maintaining economic capacity and readying us for the economic challenges of the future? I would say, first of all, we seem to have now a focus on what could be called active labour market policy from the Conservative government in the UK. Now, obviously, we've been urging them to do that, to draw on the lessons of what the Labour government in the UK did at the time of the last financial crisis, and also what the Labour government in Wales has been doing with support for young unemployed people. But I suppose the challenge now is it's really critical that that doesn't just substitute young workers who will be subsidised by government for older workers. You know, those other systems have worked because they've been really tightly integrated with local authorities, with different charitable organisations, the third sector. Not clear whether the UK so-called Kickstarter active labour market scheme will work in the same way currently. Secondly, unlike in Germany, we're seeing that furlough scheme, which is now becoming a short hours support scheme, we're seeing it being removed at the same time right across our economy without additional wage support going in to particularly hard-hit sectors. Some research out today from our independent budgetary watchdog suggesting that could lead to about 1.4 million jobs being lost. We've said that government needs to bite the bullet on this. Yes, it can be difficult to differentiate between different sectors of the economy, but it needs to appreciate this is a crisis unlike any other when governments actually mandated different sectors to shut down. It needs to have a sectorally differentiated strategy. It needs to have an industrial strategy as well. And we've only seen one major manufacturer so far supported through a government loan, the so-called Operation Birch. This is occurring far too slowly, and it's leading to a situation where, you know, in some sectors we have very, very substantial job losses without a future plan, you know, particularly within aviation. Now, obviously, we accept aviation will have to change, not least because of the climate crisis, but there will also be a structural reduction in demand probably. But that should be a planned change. It should be a strategic change rather than the kind of slogging it out we see currently between different airlines. And then, of course, we need the stimulus. And I feel like I've been going on for ages. Sorry, I'll just finish on this. I'm sure that we'll talk about it more later. As I mentioned, UK government has focused on some demand promoting forms of stimulus, you know, kind of meal discounts, cuts in value-added tax on hospitality, tourism, and it's brought forward some investment in some areas. I think we are concerned that when you compare the UK's investment package, particularly when it comes to supporting green technologies, it is quite limited compared to that of many other nations. We think this is unfortunate because clearly we need to be backing those technologies of the future. And actually, the UK's capital programme for environmental technologies is only just around the same value as Germany's investment in just one green technology, hydrogen. So we think this is a missed opportunity, one that government does need to grasp for the future. So I think I'll probably end there. There's so much to talk about, but really keen to hear from Jakob about German developments. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Huge amount of stuff into this key point about sectors being different, some needing more support, and also job creation, just feeling like it's not yet the scale of ambition that the UK needs. Jakob, we're so excited to have you on the call and to hear from the experience of Germany. Obviously, we've been admiring what you've been doing, but I'm sure for your perspective, there's always more that you want to be able to do in the future as well. So over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew and Christos, for having me, and Annelies. It's wonderful to see, even though it's only in a video conference. But I fondly remember visiting your constituency, and it was wonderful to have you in the European Parliament, and I'm absolutely delighted that you're now in such an important position as Shadow Chancellor. I think it's very much deserved. I think it's a little bit difficult for me. I will try anyway, but it's a little bit difficult for me to talk about the German situation. And I want to start it off, otherwise it will become very embarrassing, by saying, I think to an important extent, we were lucky. Of course, when things go not as badly as they could in a crisis, it's a horrible crisis situation anyway, there's a temptation to think it's sort of by one's own designs that this worked a little bit better than it could have worked out. I want to start by emphasizing that we were relatively lucky. We were relatively lucky in that Germany wasn't among the first countries hit. There were a number of countries in Asia and a number of countries in Europe that we were able to learn from. And so in a sense, I mean, I'm using the nursery rhyme. I think one way to put it is, you know, Jack be humble, Jack be quick. So I think we need to be very humble in this crisis. And there are many lessons that can be learned, both in terms of good things that other countries have done. On a number of measures we implemented, we simply took measures that we found elsewhere and found them to be successful, and then just copied them. And of course, there were a number of instances where also we were able to benefit. We had hindsight, if you will, the things that didn't work out so well, and then we tried to stay clear of them. So I think that's the first thing, first point I want to make. We're keenly, and so is the UK, of course, watching how other countries are faring. With a number of countries also, we have very good, almost weekly exchanges on, you know, what are you thinking about? What are we thinking about? Annelies, you won't be surprised to learn that this is particularly true among certain member countries in the EU, that this is quite readily the case. And so that's my first point. I think the second point is managing this crisis, I think in all countries, is a very difficult balancing act between, say, the politics of it all and political decision-making, science, and I'm talking about real science, sort of medicine, health, epidemiology, perhaps a dismal science, namely economics, but hopefully some sort of science nevertheless. It's a sort of my science, if you will, our side, and then of course administration, and making certain that the insights that one gets to, and especially when one has to bear in mind the health and the economic implications, that's a balancing act, and then actually doing things that work in the right order. It's very difficult, and it requires utmost attention, and has kept us very busy. And I think you can still tell that in the last couple of months we haven't been sleeping perhaps enough, but that's of course what happens in a crisis. I want to move quickly to our stimulus package. As a first set of economic measures, we launched what my minister called a liquidity bazooka. What he meant by that is that we made an announcement that businesses with a sound business model, as witnessed by their performance before the Corona crisis, say by their performance in 2018 and 19, they could get as much liquidity, as much government guaranteed credit as they wanted. So that I think was a great reassurance, and we had infrastructures in place through KfW and other means to not only announce it but make it a reality. That was sort of the immediate response. And then, of course, there was a relatively long and painful period when lockdown came, and we didn't know when would the lockdown be lifted. And then the government did a relatively bold move in saying, well, we know it's not going to be lifted in the next couple of weeks because we need to suppress the spreading of the virus. But we are relatively confident that by early June, the time has come to talk about an opening and a stimulus package corresponding to that opening. And so we had about 6 weeks to prepare our stimulus package, which is a long time in a crisis, corresponding also to the signal to businesses, to citizens, that this is more or less the time scale we're working in. Of course, still with some uncertainty with regards to the numbers, but I think that was a powerful political message. By early June, we're talking about a serious opening up again of the economy, and then a relatively large, both in volume and in terms of the number of measures. I believe altogether there were 57 different measures as part of that stimulus packages, trying to address a variety of issues. And I don't want to bore you with the 57 individual measures. I just want to talk about three categories of measures. The first category of measures were basically support measures for companies and for employment. Annelies talked about short-time work, or the UK version of it. It's a tried and tested system. It's up and running all the time in Germany. It was developed during the financial crisis, but it was made significantly more generous in the current crisis, helping to stabilize people's expectations and helping to avoid mass unemployment. We had short-term work, of course, shooting up, not unemployment going up a lot. And I think what's also very important, what happens as a result of short-time work is that not some people are out of the job entirely, but that many people work shorter hours. And the difference between their normal full-time employment and the de facto part-time work, that's where the short-time work scheme skips in. And the incentives are different. The incentives without short-time work is you fire people because you don't have anything else for them to do. And with short-time work, you reduce hours for many, and it makes it much easier, of course, also for people to come back because they haven't really left at all. So I think that was an element, the bazooka. Also some grants for businesses, especially small businesses, where it wasn't credit-based, but it basically helping their equity position. That was also an important part of the package, and in sum total, to the tune of 50 billion euros. So large package. That was the more sort of supply side oriented part of the stimulus package. Then there's a more demand side oriented, because of course it's a supply shock, the corona crisis, the lockdown and all the rest of it, but it feeds through rapidly. And that's what also economic historians worked out very clearly in previous epidemic situations. A demand shock follows relatively quickly. And so we have demand side measures, including a temporary VAT cut, including a supplemental child benefits for mid and low income earners, which tend to be credit constrained. So there's a good chance that they'll actually spend money. And a third component that is not very much reported, but an important element is part of our energy transition. We fund our subsidies for the renewable sector by means of an electricity levy. And that's, of course, disproportionately paid by poorer households. And slowly but surely, we need to move away from that. And so what we've managed to do, we've introduced a partial tax funding of the legacy costs of our energy transition, which basically makes clean electricity a little bit less expensive. And that also helps on the demand side, but that brings me to the third pillar of the package. Around about 1/3 of the overall size is all about transformation. So it's not getting money out in the next 3 weeks. It's a 1 to 3 year, slightly longer term agenda to accelerate energy transition, to help with digitalization, and generally make our economy more competitive, including by more generous schemes on research and development. As part of that, Annelies, you'll be delighted to find that hydrogen played a critical role, which in part of our energy intensive industry electricity by itself is not what one needs in order to produce steel. There's a sort of fossil fuel or say hydrocarbon element to it, and that's where hydrogen comes in, because it's easy to then have hydrocarbons that are not a problem for the atmosphere, typically generated by means of electricity. And so we're building an infrastructure there. We're launching, we're subsidizing generation capacity, and of course we also have 2 billion dedicated to sourcing of green hydrogen from the rest of the world, because of course even though the sun is shining right now in Berlin, our sun shines, just like in Britain by the way, shines a little bit less than in other parts of the world. I suppose that's why we like to travel so much, and so it's easier to generate electricity, be it solar or wind power in other parts of the world, and that's of course part of the scheme. So there are these three: it's supply side, there's demand side, and then there's the transformative element, and finally, and there I come to close. This is a package that hopefully will bring us to the end of this fiscal year. But for next fiscal year, there'll of course be the 2021 household, the budget, and we'll have to, in light of the information that keeps coming in, design it appropriately. So hopefully we won't need a third supplementary budget for this year, but we don't know yet. So we have to keep an open mind. That's also a political balancing act. One doesn't want to take it from week to week and have a new set of measures every week, small measures. That would be good in terms of using the best information available all the time, but it would be bad because it would be disorienting and politically very difficult. So having bigger packages is a good thing, but the idea of today doing something that will last for the next 2 years, that's ridiculous, because the future is simply far too uncertain for that. So we try to choose a middle ground and have a fairly substantial package, roughly in line with the size of the shock, 6 to 7% of GDP, and with a variety of measures. I'll leave it at that for now, and I'm looking much forward to the discussion.
I'd just like to say thank you to both speakers there for that very interesting, indeed fascinating insights into the perspectives in both countries there. Just a quick word of welcome to this afternoon's participants from the Aston Centre for Europe. And for those of you who don't know us so well, we are a research centre based at Aston University in Birmingham. A research centre perhaps with a difference in that we are academics, but we engage quite heavily with contemporary policy issues right across the European Union and in its member states, and of course in Britain post-Brexit as well. And delighted also to reconnect with Annalisa, who's a former colleague and now an honorary professor in our centre as well. But it's my job this afternoon to present to both the speakers some of the questions which have been raised in the question and answer box here by our audience. We're going to try and organise them thematically, if that's okay. And there have been a few questions that have popped up that have been quite popular, obviously perhaps to do with Brexit and what happens next, the challenges that presents, in addition to all of the questions that have been raised by yourselves in your presentations. So the first question from Wilfried Legg relates to the risk of a no-deal outcome, the potential of the UK trading on WTO rolls after the 31st of December, and where you see this leading, which trading arrangements post-Brexit would be best for Britain now in trying to achieve progressive economic development and the kind of progressive policies that you've both been advocating. And secondly, in comparison with the EU, there's a question here from Conrad Winch, who's asked whether there might be an opportunity for Britain to emulate what's happening in Europe with regard to digital taxation, financial transaction tax, country-by-country reporting for multinationals. This obviously speaks to your own personal histories here, and whether or not there is an opportunity here for the UK also to demand some kind of tax justice post-Brexit. So it's about looking more broadly as to what happens next. I'll offer those two questions to start with.
Okay, maybe if I kick off, if that's okay with you, Jakob, and then you can come in afterwards. And thanks very much indeed, Carolyn. And it's lovely being here with the Aston Centre for Europe as well. It's really fantastic. first of all, around the situation concerning Brexit, I mean, obviously the UK government has maintained that it will be able to achieve a deal, that it will be a deal that will protect the UK economy. That's their words, not mine. They've said that they'll be able to deliver that, and therefore I should anticipate we've been pushing them very hard to demonstrate that they're genuinely engaging with the negotiations that are required. We're already seeing, I would say, many chickens coming home to roost in the UK press. Just today we saw, you know, some would say some surprise over the fact that we'll need to have many hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of additional customs declarations if we go down the path that the UK government appears to be suggesting we may need to. Actually, that's not a surprise. That's something that, you know, we've been warning about for really a very long time, the risks of that additional bureaucracy. And I think the major concern that I have from an economic point of view, and probably the questioner was linking to, is that clearly many companies will have struggled through this period with all the disruption to supply chains, with all the impact on demand, and we could then end up with additional trade barriers coming into place towards the end of the year. And in many cases, that would simply be the straw that would break the camel's back, and many firms would be likely to go bust as a result of that. Now, whether that is necessarily what's likely to happen, I'm not sure. You know, I do think that on the EU side, there seems to be a lot of pragmatism around this. Hopefully some of the theatre, certainly from the UK side, can be pulled out of it, and we can end up with a decent situation. But certainly I am concerned about the economic impact of this. Around taxation, interestingly enough, just last week we tried to, or actually I think it's 2 weeks ago, we tried to get the UK government to switch on country by country reporting. Actually, we already have got through a Labour amendment from former Labour MP Caroline Flint. We already have that on the UK statute book, just hasn't been switched on by governments. They've got the legal ability to implement it, but they haven't done it so far. We will keep pushing on that. On digital taxation, well, we are introducing in the UK a so-called digital services tax. From the Labour side, we've been relatively critical of it. I mean, we think it is necessary to put measures in place, perhaps in the absence of international agreement. We'd far rather see much more engagement to try and create that international agreement, by the way. But the digital services tax actually is a slightly strangely constructed tax because it's focused purely on digital activities. It wouldn't be getting much of a handle on, for example, the Amazons of this world. And I think we probably will need to be looking at this in much more detail into the future, especially when, obviously, businesses, sorry, I always use this phrase, and it's probably a little bit getting a bit hackneyed now, but those businesses based on bricks in the UK are at a tax disadvantage compared to those based on clicks, because we've got that business rates system that I referred to before. So tax justice, critically important. I suppose for me, the big concern I have about the UK system perhaps is that our state capacity, our government capacity, has been shown to be below what many of us would have wanted it to be through this crisis. So really need to build that up so that we can engage with some of these big tax questions for the future.
Yes, I mean, I think, Annelies, you've said it all, but what I can add, and Caroline, my apologies, I should have mentioned you to start with. Thank you very much for hosting us. It's difficult for me to say what's best for Britain, but I think in the abstract, it was recognized, of course, in Britain in the 19th century already with the repeal of the Corn Laws, that by and large trades tends to be something mutually beneficial. And so to the extent that we are convinced that a continued close trading relationship with Britain is in our best interest in the EU, it would be surprising if it turned out to be that it wasn't in the best interest of Britain. But of course, every country has to make up its own mind about what's best for them. but I think by and large, trade is something mutually beneficial, and artificially, ending up in a situation where trade barriers that weren't there before are now erected would tend to create problems and a loss in welfare. So I think that's as much as I can say about that. On taxation, I think in fairness, one needs to recognize there's a very good OECD process on minimum taxation that also includes the issue of digital taxation, where a lot of progress has been made. But unfortunately, right now, that process is a little bit stuck, possibly also because of the upcoming election in the US. And so there's some difficulties, but nevertheless, we very much hope that in October, and by the way, they were closely working together with Britain. It's a subject that Britain is also keen on, to try and find a good solution so that the most extreme forms of really very problematic fiscal tax competition would no longer be profitable, and I think that would be a very good thing. On country by country reporting, I don't want to bore you with the domestic politics in Germany, but there's a slight difference in perspective between the two coalition partners, but I don't want to go into the details.
Thank you both. If I may return to the questions in our chat box here, there seems to be a little bit of interest in taking the conversation towards skills, training and education. A question from Maria Cox, who's asked quite rightly, how do we give our next generation hope through all of this? Tony Scusa is asking also, how can we allow for our education system to improve and redress the inequalities, the different treatment of different children and sectors within our education system? I guess these are challenges we haven't really touched on at the current juncture. And there's a question linked to that from Andreas Bush, who's also asking about the UK's persistent skills problem and where plans are to take skills training more seriously and raise it up the policy agenda. I'll pass that back to you.
Sure, would I kick off again? Does that make sense, Caroline? And then, yeah, brilliant. First of all, for Maria's question, I do think this is really important, and clearly we're seeing in the UK, and I mean, I'm sure it's the case to an extent in Germany as well, but probably a bit more intense in the UK, that the impact on young people entering the labour market for the first time is very, very strong. I mean, we already knew, there's been quite a lot of research done into this by the Resolution Foundation in the UK in particular. We already knew that young people in the UK were less likely to have the kind of earnings potential that their parents had had. So the kind of generational improvements that we've been seeing previously had been pretty much choked off for young people. There was actually, interestingly, very low job mobility for many young people compared to what you would expect. I mean, variety of different reasons for that, potentially high housing costs being part of it, and relatively low social security compared to those costs, but probably many other factors as well. Indeed, the availability of kind of transferable and specific skills, I'm sure, playing into that also. I mean, we have been calling for the UK government to learn from what's worked previously. So that Kickstarter scheme that I mentioned that the UK government announced last week, we do think is a step in the right direction, but really critically, and I think this relates to the questions about skills as well, it's very important that it is properly coordinated so that we don't just see that scheme as effectively, you know, substituting in some cases subsidised younger workers for older workers, so that we also don't see a kind of cycling of Kickstarter young people through the system, not ending up having permanent opportunities with different employers. I mean, when these kind of systems have worked before in the UK, there's been a lot of engagement and oversight from local government, from the third sector, charities and so forth, to make sure these schemes actually work for young people. I think that's very important. I would just say, though, finally, let's not forget, and I'm sure that Maria, the questioner, wasn't doing this, let's not forget about older workers. I mean, if you're a kind of 60-year-old in the UK, potentially becoming unemployed for the first time, you've worked all your life in hospitality or tourism, currently you could actually end up still being sanctioned now if you go into a job centre and you're viewed as not being compliant with the different requirements. That was switched on again from this month. Really not a sensible approach to be taking to older workers. When it comes to the education system and to skills as well, I mean, first of all, we've had really a very difficult period, I would say, for the UK's schools over the last few months. Of course, they've remained open because they have still been having key workers' children coming into those schools. But we've had, sadly, quite a divisive debate in the UK. You know, we would have wanted to see, and we continually urged our government to set up an inclusive process, bringing together trade unions, teachers, parents, so that together we could have an approach to reopening schools that would command confidence. Instead, we really had them kind of setting off teachers, particularly their trade unions, against parents, which really wasn't very helpful. And actually, a lot of parents are quite nervous about their children going to school. We have lower rates of children in the UK going to school than in Germany, for example. And that is an enormous concern because, you know, we already have an unequal education system in the UK that produces quite polarised outcomes. That looks like it's going to be turbocharged. You know, we would have wanted to see more action over the summer to help with catch-up. You know, running out of time for that to be put in place. But, you know, above all, we need to make sure our schools are going to be ready for the September full reopening that is scheduled to occur. And on skills, as I said before, I think one of the big challenges for the UK is around coordination. And obviously, I mean, there's been a lot written about this, you know, kind of remembering all those debates about, you know, liberal market economies as against coordinated market economies. I mean, clearly the UK's had a very liberalised approach to skills development that hasn't really delivered what we've needed, you know, arguably, particularly for young people. You know, although we've got an apprenticeship, you know, a wide-scale apprenticeship scheme, for example, actually the lowest number of low-skilled young people who've been going into those apprenticeships has actually been going down over time rather than going up. So we need to improve all of that. Part of this, I would say now, is about having the kind of crisis schemes working well, but we would say also you need to be developing regional capacity and local capacity here. You know, some of the metro mayors, combined authorities, local authorities have been working very, very closely with business associations, local trade unions. They need to, oh, sorry, don't worry, I don't have to go and vote. That's just starting a new debate. But we need to really push that forward for the future. Sorry about that noise.
Thank you. I'll pass back to Jakob.
Yeah, I mean, one number that we found very instructive and quite shocking is that under reasonable assumptions, if a student loses 1/3 of a school year, the impact on lifetime earnings could be as much as 3 to 4% lower lifetime earnings. So that's very substantial. And then, of course, you can say it's a unique situation what we're going through. Perhaps the evidence that we have of the impact on shorter time spent in school isn't the right empirical evidence. But I think as a starting point of the discussion, it's useful to have that number in mind. And if one adds to that the observation, which I believe to be roughly speaking correct, and we know that from evidence of the impact of summer holidays on school performance, for children spending their summer holiday in households with less educated parents or caregivers, the distance in terms of scholastic achievement is widened during the summer holiday quite substantially compared to those students who spend their holiday with very well educated parents. And so using that fact, we can estimate the difference, the differential impact of what losing 1/3 of a school year has on typically poorer children or children with poorer parents and more privileged children. And so that's very serious in terms of widening future income gaps. And it was very much on our mind. And one thing, unfortunately, where we struggled, partly to do with German federalism, schools, of course, are not the responsibility of the central government, but of the regions, but partly also because the scientific evidence of how important schools are for spreading the disease is a little bit ambiguous. We didn't have a very clear strategy on schooling, and now it's the summer holiday, and hopefully I'm reasonably optimistic that after the summer holiday, unless we have a second surge in infections, schools will go back not to normal, but to kind of new normal where these things matter a little bit less. But just to respond to the question that was asked, not only generally, but very specifically in times of Corona, education and differences in the educational impact of Corona by social class, if you will, play a big role in our thinking, and is a real area of concern. I was delighted when I heard that in Berlin, and not every region is acting the same, and now they're doing summer schools for and children who weren't able to go to school and who feel maybe a good idea in order to catch up, to have teachers. They're now working, if you will, overtime to teach students, if they want to, a little bit of the subject matter that they weren't able to learn in the past couple of months. But it really is a problem. And by the way, that's also true for vocational training. We have a reasonably good system of vocational training in Germany, but if a company is in lockdown, it's a bit difficult to learn to acquire the kind of skills one would have otherwise. There's lots of things one can do via, I don't know, teleworking, but how to, I don't know, run a certain piece of machinery that produces tools and shapes pieces of metal, it's not among those things one can learn at a distance. So it's a bit of a challenge there as well.
Thank you both. Really interesting to hear your responses there. And thank you to everybody who's putting questions into the Q&A box here. Some really great questions that I'm going to cluster together and pass over to our two speakers this afternoon. So if I may, I'm going to challenge you now to move from the very micro level back up to the macro level. There's a couple of more reflective questions coming from the audience. Roger Luffman says that he believes the Western economic system has suffered a fatal blow. So the question is its position irrecoverable? And that chimes perhaps with other questions that are looking to understand where the opportunities are structurally in this current crisis. So we have a question here: should we be trying to get back to where we were before March, or should we be seeing this particular point in time as an opportunity to change the nature of the balance between economy and society more broadly? And that links to a really great question by David Gow, who's asking us to perhaps reflect on what's happened in Germany, where the CDU-SPD coalition has backed substantial state intervention as a way to reboot the economy. And his question more broadly is looking to understand whether now we see then a greater role for the state and state involvement in the economy as a key element of progressive economics. And is that then going to be the case for the foreseeable future? So perhaps I could ask you both speakers to reflect on those issues, and I'll hand firstly to Annalisa, if I may.
Oh, I thought we were going to swap over so Jakob could have the first crack. I'm sure he'll be far more erudite than I could be on this. But from my tuppence worth, I mean, really interesting questions. I think first of all, Roger's question. I mean, I'm not sure that I totally agree. I think actually we see different economies, certainly, you know, democratic economies, which have fared far better than others during this crisis, you know, for a whole variety of different reasons. It's quite an interesting report produced by the OECD, which looked at the hit from one wave or two waves of coronavirus on different national economies. And quite interestingly, suggested that the hit on the UK's economy could be one of the most intense from a single wave and also from more than one wave. Variety of different reasons for that. In fact, you know, they've got kind of over 200 variables in their model. But, you know, I do wonder whether, and in fact, the UK Chancellor himself has acknowledged this, the very, very service heavy nature of the UK economy has meant that it's particularly difficult for us to weather this crisis compared to many other nations. I mean, we seem to be particularly badly affected by a lack of new vacancies coming through into the job market, for example, which really concerns me because, you know, we really need that, obviously, to be helping unemployed people back into work as quickly as possible. And actually, if you look at some of those systems which have been very, very closed, and certainly political systems that have been more authoritarian, I don't think their response has been a positive one a lot of the time. You know, it's often been, you know, quite a negative one. So I think maybe a mixed picture, and certainly I hope it will not be a fatal blow. You know, I think we are getting used to that new normal. Of course, we don't know how long it will last, but there is much that needs to be done. I suppose that relates to the second question. I think, you know, on the left, we've got to be quite careful how we talk about this. I mean, clearly in the UK context, we've seen you know, many thousands of people have died. You know, people have had their lives changed irrevocably. So of course, this does offer a moment of reflection and a time when we can reset some aspects of our economy, hopefully. But I think we need to be, I'm not suggesting that the questioner wasn't doing this, but I think we need to be quite wary about, you know, some people saying this is a kind of moment of opportunity. Of course, for so many, it's been a terrible time that they've been through. I think what it really has done is it's shone a light on where there was a lack of resilience in particular, especially in the UK. So, you know, we've seen, you know, if we didn't know there was a major problem with our social care system before this crisis, we certainly know it now. If we didn't know there was a problem with precarious work in the UK context and with bogus self-employment, we certainly know it now. So I think that it is shining a light on some areas where there are particular weaknesses, but then there's a huge amount that we need to do to make sure they're actually sorted out, because I think so many people's desire is to go back to something that approaches what was there before, even if it really didn't work for very large numbers of people, as in the UK context. And then finally, the question around state intervention. I mean, I think this is a really interesting question, and it's one where actually I think we can contrast different countries' responses quite substantially. So, for example, in the UK context, the Chancellor has been very much against, in his words, picking winners. So we've been trying to push him to take a sectoral approach. He's resisted that and says, no, I don't want to pick winners. You know, obviously our view is, well, the state here has created losers, you know, for understandable reasons, because it's had to close lots of businesses, but it's created losers. So let's please try and help them. But that, I think, reflects quite a different approach, and where there still is probably quite a big gulf between, I guess, the centre and left, perhaps, and the right in some responses on this. You know, we've seen quite substantial amounts of public spending in the UK context, more than many people would have expected. You know, I keep having journalists saying to me, oh, surely you're delighted that all of this money is being spent. And I'm saying, well, it needs to be spent in the right direction to, you know, maintain people's living standards, protect employment, and prepare us for the future. And actually, some of what we've seen going on has been, to me, reflecting a lack of engagement, particularly with those big sectoral issues, compared to many other countries.
Yeah, I'll try and complement that a little bit. Sort of on Roger's question, I'm not sure whether I fully understood the question, but to the extent that I have, I feel it really goes back to a very old debate among progressives, Of course, they were the reform-minded and the revolutionary-minded. And I'm delighted. I'm at Fabian Society in the company of the reform-minded rather than the revolutionary-minded. But of course, whenever there's a crisis, the revolutionary-minded, what they're secretly hoping is that there will be collapse and the world will be on fire. And from the ashes of that catastrophe, an entirely new society will be built. And the reform-minded, and I would certainly count myself amongst them, a very serious crisis like the present one is an opportunity to the extent that certain reforms that are overdue, or I use the word transformation, certain transformation developments that we know need to happen anyway, such as energy transition, for example, such as digitalization, but certainly also with regards to social justice and fairness, certain transformations that need to happen anyway, maybe can be accelerated. And maybe if now governments, coming to the second question, if now governments use a lot of money, and maybe one can use at least part of that money to steer the course in the spirit of that reform or of that transformation. And I think if one were able to, that would be a good thing. And I think to some extent we are managing just that with our policies. More sort of in the abstract, I think what we're coming to realize is that in the area of insurance, where for a long time we already knew that, newborns, they can't sign insurance contracts, and it would be dangerous to allow their parents. I mean, who knows, if I make a mistake and then my children, we have 4 children, they have to live with that mistake until they're 90, that would be very, very unfair. And so I think having a sort of caretaker system where it's not necessarily the parents, but a hopefully more reliable democracy decides on the insurance contract for the newborns is a preferable system. And so we have that, and that's one of the reasons why, of course, we have a lot of public insurance for individual risks. But when it comes to these big risks in crises, be it a banking crisis or be it a corona crisis, I think it's safe to say that they are also, for rather fundamental reason, the market economy fails to deliver the kind of insurance policies at a reasonable price that one would need to weather the storm. And it's a very important function of government to provide that implicit ex post. It's after the event happens, all of a sudden people are insured, they didn't pay premium, other than taxes, of course. And that's a very important function of the state. And we need to take it very seriously. Of course, we mustn't fall into the trap of now saying, because we help thousands and thousands of companies, that we now want to run them all. We're certainly a long way away from wanting to do that, and I think it should stay that way. But the fear of running too many companies mustn't stop us from helping the companies. And it's a very interesting discussion we have in Germany right now, where I actually think one of the ways in which we can make certain that our involvement with many of the private companies we're talking about remains temporary is by striking a good bargain from the perspective of the taxpayer, not giving too big a present, say, for example, to legacy bondholders or stockholders, so that when in a couple of years down the road, the government wants to retract, then, for example, we can sell our stake, hopefully not at a colossal loss, but at a small profit, which makes it politically much easier to get out of it again. And so I think striking a sort of negotiating very hard, striking a tough bargain will actually help us to then get out of the many companies that we help a little bit faster. And so I think the government does have a very important role to play right now. and the role isn't just to make legacy stockholders richer.
Thank you. Plenty of food for thought in those answers, both of you. Appreciate that. Whilst the discussion's taken us generally in the direction of how the coronavirus crisis is leading to lasting change in our economies, there are a few questions relating to the extent to which you expect to see the crisis bringing about lasting change in our political behaviour and the politics of both of our countries going forward as well. So there's an interesting question from Paola Mattei in the chat here, asking you both to reflect on whether you think the economic crisis is likely to benefit the populist parties and their leaders, and what risks do you see that extreme right-wing parties in particular will be gaining in political clout as the year progresses, and potentially we have to navigate our way through a second spike in the autumn. Also manipulating the economic kind of impact of the coronavirus crisis. A second question in the chat also related to parties of the left and how they stand to either benefit or lose out from the particular challenges that this crisis has brought about. So perhaps I'll offer this in a reverse order this time. Maybe Jakob, you would like to answer the question first.
Yeah, it was very comfortable to have Annelies go first. On this question about populism, I think it's a little bit ambiguous. On the one hand, of course, I think one way to characterize populism is that one tries to make people believe that complicated questions have very simple answers. I think the corona crisis poses very serious, rather complicated questions. And those who believe that the answers are really very simple, often they haven't fared so well so far in that crisis. And I think that's something that many citizens recognize. And so to that extent, I think the crisis is something that is going to weaken populism, at least the kind of populism that I've just hopefully not too unfairly tried to portray. On the other hand, if the crisis is mishandled and people somehow feel that the government hasn't done its job properly, then of course, if populists are in opposition, the likelihood of those populists perhaps growing stronger purely on account of the fact that they were in opposition when things went badly, I mean, that's a distinct possibility. And so I think it's ambiguous, and it's a test, if you like. The crisis is a test for non-populists, and I think if non-populists are able to deliver, they will do well. And if non-populists fail to deliver, they will do not so well. I mean, that's not a terribly deep insight, but that's the way I would look at it. And I leave the second question to Annelies.
I mean, I very much agree with what Jakob just said. I suppose a couple of additional reflections, and I think they kind of draw the two questions together, really. Certainly in the UK, I mean, we've had quite a lot of argument in the UK, I mean, partly linked to the Brexit debate, but other matters as well, around the idea of experts and, whether experts are to be trusted. I think arguably there has been quite a big shift in public opinion now. I mean, we rely on experts very, very obviously to deal with this crisis. So hopefully some of the kind of disdain of, I suppose, a more expert technocratic approach to things has diminished in the UK. So that would be a shift away from a kind of more populist approach, perhaps. Secondly, what Jakob said about the kind of where there's a populist opposition, I think is significant. And of course, for populists, they can kind of turn that round into a general critique of government. I mean, we've been thinking about this quite a lot within the Labour Party. I mean, on just about any measure, very, very sadly, the kind of central direction that's been provided from the political side, you know, whether we're talking about testing or protective equipment or, you know, localized lockdowns or whatever, it's been very messy, to put it mildly. You know, I'm kind of using polite words here. It's not been effective. But then if we, you know, we want to make it clear that this is a kind of political problem rather than necessarily public institutions per se not being able to deal with this kind of a crisis, because actually in the UK context, our National Health Service, kind of almost, you know, away from political impact, has done incredible things during this crisis. I mean, I'm sure people on this call will be aware that, I mean, building entirely new hospitals from scratch, not being overwhelmed, you know, everything else that has been done within the NHS has been incredibly impressive, but that's kind of not been necessarily with the support of central government, but it has shown that public institutions are important. I mean, I'd be concerned if we ended up with a situation where the suggestion was that, you know, public institutions couldn't be trusted. I mean, maybe some of the kind of US discussions would be trailing into that kind of a direction. But then finally, and I suppose linking this with the last question, I think there's some on the left who think that this kind of a crisis will naturally lead to an increase in support for the left, because yeah, people will be seeing those kind of problems that I talked about before, you know, with the social care system, for example, with the labour market, and they will automatically think that the left is the answer. I don't think that is the case. I think it's very much the situation that the onus is on progressive parties to very strongly make those links there, because we know as well that, you know, when people are in economically distressed circumstances, and I think, you know, we've learned from what happened after the global financial crisis, many on the left saying then, now is our moment, you know, now is the time when we can finally get into power because people will see that we are the answer. Well, actually that didn't happen, you know, very often. In fact, the opposite was the case. And I think critically for us on the progressive side, the centre left side, it's about showing that we provide that security. You know, what Jakob said about insurance, that it is, you know, it's kind of our side of politics that provides the security that people require. It has not been provided by the right during this crisis. It could be provided, and it is being provided in many cases through social democratic parties and our approach to politics from the progressive side. But we've got to fight for it to get that view, I would say, accepted more generally in our populations.
Thank you both. So we're coming to a close now. There are just one or two questions perhaps I could throw out there for final kind of reflections before we draw a line under our discussions this afternoon. There's a straightforward question here from David Gow, who's just asking, is neoliberalism dead? This is probably picking up on your answers to the previous question. And then we have some more specific questions to issues within particularly the British economy. I'm wondering whether I can bring a few of those together. There are some concerns here about repossession proceedings, evictions, those sorts of things, and the degree to which there's been consultation with trade unions and employers associations as we develop a response to the current crisis. So as you can see, there's a lot of general interest. There are lots of disparate questions going on here, and we've had a great discussion this afternoon. So perhaps I could just invite you to think of some more broad, reflective comments that you'd like to just pass back to the audience before we go our separate ways. I'll pass to Annalisa first this time, shall I?
Sure, thank you. I mean, I suppose this would be the academic response. I suppose it depends how you define neoliberalism, doesn't it? Whether you say that it's dead or not. I mean, I suppose what has been shown, and you know, I very much agree with what Jakob said earlier about this. What has been shown is that a purely kind of free market approach has failed. I mean, no question about it. I think we've seen that again to an extent in the UK, where, you know, particularly around provision of things like protective equipment or testing, actually isn't necessarily a free market approach. It's an approach of saying, well, we can't have that coordination locally and regionally. We need to bring in very large companies to deliver that capacity for us. And surprise, surprise, it hasn't worked very well. I mean, it's no criticism of people working in those companies. I'm sure they're doing the best that they can, but it's not coordinated with any kind of intermediate institution. So I think from that point of view, yes, it's not the answer to this. Actually, really interesting international questions here around whether we still see a kind of neoliberal approach internationally. And I would say there, a lot of governments have been working very, very hard around issues like, supporting highly indebted poor countries. Haven't yet seen the buy-in from many of the private debtors that we would need to see. So perhaps at an international level, it's a little bit more alive than I might want to see. But hopefully that may change over over the next weeks and months. On evictions, etc. This is a particular concern in the UK context because, of course, our social security doesn't cover people's rental costs. We have quite a kind of high bar for people accessing it as well if they've got any savings. That means, if people have any kind of savings to get a deposit together, that can get knocked out really quickly if you lose your job and you need to access social security. So we do think that needs to be changed as a matter of priority. Otherwise we could get into really, really difficult territory. And then finally around kind of consultation with different actors. I mean, it's been kind of in some ways positive in the UK, in other ways negative. So we did have quite a lot of consultation with trade unions and business associations initially at the beginning of the crisis, particularly when the job retention scheme, the furlough scheme and the self-employed scheme were created. But that's kind of tailed off a bit. And those bodies which are meant to bring together trade unions, businesses and government in a tripartite manner haven't really been playing the substantive role that we would want to see them playing. So, for example, we have a health and safety executive in the UK. It's been massively reduced in resource over recent years. And, arguably, it's just simply not able, without additional resource, to be able to be, really checking that workplaces are safe, this kind of thing. I think that's a big problem because just like puppies aren't just for Christmas, trade unions and business associations aren't just there for one decision. They can help with many other decisions into the future. And, I just finished by saying they're particularly critical for some of those skills issues that Andreas and Tony as well around the education side mentioned before. We really need to be learning from those who've got expertise and working with them to make sure that in different local areas we have the support that's necessary.
One of the best experiences for me during the difficult last couple of months has been a weekly round that we did of brilliant economists of different, I would say, political persuasion, 25 to 35 participated. My sense is that neoliberalism is dead in two ways. The first way is that, of course, neoliberalism is often a word that is used to accuse others, saying, you're a neoliberal, I don't talk to you. And that wasn't the case. As I said, these were very good discussions, experts coming together, offering their perspective. Often there's not one perspective that is the absolute truth. If one wants to develop sound policies, it's useful to look at things from different angles, and then ultimately, of course, one has to decide and make up one's mind. And it was possible to do that because neoliberalism, to some extent, was dead as an accusation of why one doesn't talk to others. But I think neoliberalism was also dead in the other sense of the word, that people that one might have been inclined to call neoliberal were quite willing in these exceptional circumstances to engage in a constructive discussions on not only what are the things that perhaps the government should shy away from, but what are the things that even from the perspective of a so-called neoliberal, a government should certainly engage in. in order to weather this crisis. And so the experience over the last couple of months, I'm not sure how long it will last, but for now, I think neoliberalism is dead in both senses of the word. And if it stays that way, I would find it a very good thing. I want to perhaps, even though the question, Carolyn, you didn't ask the question, but I saw among the comments a question about the European and international dimension. I think that's very important. I didn't want to dwell too much on it because I know in the UK it's a touchy subject, and I certainly don't want to sort of talk about Brexit. But what I do want to talk about is that in the German government came to realize by doing a lot at home on the supply and the demand side transformation, that's clearly helping Europe. It's helping our closest partners. When we generate additional demand, it stimulates the single market, and if they do the same thing, it helps us. But the sum of individual national policies will still not be enough in a serious crisis like this to deal with the problem. And that's, of course, the reason why there was a Franco-German proposal for a recovery fund to help, in particular, those countries and regions most affected. And I think that's the right thing. Again, in the spirit of ensuring collectively against things that one cannot insure against individually, in this case as countries. And if done well, and if done with care, that can add a lot of value. And that's you know, what a union to some extent is about. It's not without its problems, but I think it can certainly help in this kind of situation. And more broadly speaking, there is this international dimension. And I was delighted that it was possible in the G20, so with a very diverse set of countries, including the UK and including Germany, and I think we both played a very constructive role in that, to have a debt moratorium for the poorest countries. And it's going to be a challenge this autumn when the question becomes, do we need to extend it? Do we need some supplementary measures to find the right answers? What we haven't seen so far, and I think that's also a good thing, we haven't seen a generalized emerging market crisis. In previous global crises, that was often the case, that everybody said, oh, emerging markets are dangerous, and then even countries without any objective troubles, they all of a sudden there was market panic and they found themselves in a very difficult spot. That so far, that is, we've been able to keep that under control. That is also true for global financial stability. Let's keep our fingers crossed, but also actively work on making sure that it stays that way.
Thank you, Jakob, and really great there to end on such a positive note about the value of international cooperation in light of today's discussions that we've been having. So it falls to me to wrap up this afternoon and to offer thanks to both of our speakers for their time and for sharing your insights with everybody here this afternoon. And I'm sure that the rest of the audience will agree with me that we've all benefited enormously from this opportunity to compare and contrast the different perspectives in both our countries and our shared responses to shared challenges. So thank you from the Aston Centre for Europe at Aston University. Thank you also from the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung in London. And thank you also on behalf of the Fabian Society for giving your time so freely this afternoon. Great to speak with you, and I'm going to close the meeting. Thank you both.
Thank you.